On today's show, we take a look at climate change, gender, specifically women's work, in rich, developed countries. Hello and welcome you watching The Ledge. I'm your host, Lola Acala. So glad that you could join us in another episode of our show. Today, we're talking gender, specifically women's work in a climate-changing world. There is no doubt that global warming is one of the most serious environmental concerns of our time, and the issue of how government tackles climate change is always front and center of the development of green job policy initiatives and funding. But what is most troubling for most advocates of women's policies is that there are no gender considerations that are inclusive of women in green job policy initiatives. And where we do have policy initiatives that have the right rhetoric of inclusiveness, the reality is that the exclusion of women still tends to be very much the norm in green job industries and policy initiatives. And with me in the studio now to discuss this issue is Fraser University Political Science, Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Professor. It's the lovely Marjorie Cohen. Hello.
Hello.
It's great to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here.
I think it's, I should probably say it's fitting for me to say that you and I have a bit of a history.
We do.
Indeed. I have a degree, political science degree from Fraser University, and you happen to be one of my political science professors over the years. You had an incredible impact on my focal viewpoint of the world. So, indeed. And I probably should also mention that, my final year in university, you were part of my very first ever when I created The Ledge, and my first show was on, I created a show on the topic gender wage and equity in Canada, and you had enough faith and trust in me to be a part of that. And so I just want to say thank you so much for that.
And so much has happened. It's wonderful.
Oh my God. I know, I haven't seen you since then, so It's really wonderful to see you here.
Delightful to be here.
So let's get right to it. At the end of June, just recently, a few months ago, a number of researchers in the environment and labor from Sweden, the UK, Australia, US, Canada, all descended on Vancouver for a very important conference to discuss and iron out issues on climate change, gender, and work in rich developed countries. And you were one of those researchers. Now, if you could, please share some of that, what the crux of the issues were and why they were so important.
Well, I actually organized this conference, and I did it because I'm very interested in the issue of women and labor, of course, but also climate change. And what I noticed, I've been working on this myself, but what I noticed is that there were very few women very few of any kind of researchers in rich countries, that is, highly developed countries, who were dealing with this issue. Now, this doesn't mean that is an issue that is ignored. It is dealt with, but usually in the context of poor countries or developing nations. And the reason I use poor there because I'm using rich countries to be referred to ours, but yes, normally it's referred to as developing nations. And the reason for that, I think, is because it's so obvious in developing nations what's happening. Women are very close to the resource sector, to agriculture, and so international agencies that are interested in development know that they have to deal with women if they're going to deal with issues of climate change.
Indeed.
This doesn't happen in wealthier countries. And so I found the very few people who are dealing with this in Australia, Sweden, UK, Germany, US, and Canada. And I brought them together so that we could talk about how to make this issue visible.
Indeed, so important. And there's no doubt that women have come a long way from some of the discriminations of the past, but on the topic of this issue, there still seems to be this very much sexual division of labor that is so entrenched in the fabrics of our societies that really still continue to make the integration of women into male-dominated job industries so unsuccessful, especially, let's talk about some of the numbers which show that women only account for 6% of skilled trade workforce. That's not very much success.
No, that's not very much, and that is a percentage between 4 and 6% that hasn't changed in the last 40 years. So this is fairly phenomenal, and it's not just in Canada; it's in other countries too. It's also true in the United States. And you're right. The sexual division of labor is really very, very much entrenched. But right now, it seems as though the only way to get the topic of gender and climate change looked at is to say, oh, well, we've got to get more women into the skills trades. And while this is important, I don't have a lot of faith that this is going to happen sufficiently that it is going to make a big difference to women in any case. So I do think that we have to look further and to look at what we consider when we talk about public policy and climate change. What are the other kinds of jobs we can be looking at and should be looking at?
Indeed. You know, let's talk a little bit about, you know, Canada's investment record and the will to, in fact, actually put, you know, the issue of clean energy and, you know, energy programs and policies that really are inclusive of women at the forefront of policy. When we look at what is being done in the U.S., the United States has allocated and is spent at least about $831 billion towards, you know, projects and programs, you know, aimed at, you know, the employment of women into green jobs. If we look at what we've done here in Canada, I mean, Canada has spent about $1 billion, you know, we've put about $1 billion into our green infrastructure fund. When we look at what we've done here in our province, you know, there are many that will argue that, you know, there's very little that's green about building a very large electrical transmission line to support mining activity. I mean, how, and especially with no, you know, plans to, you know, employ women or, you know, green projects that will employ women. I mean, these are the kinds of, you know, moves that leads one to think that this is not even a priority at all.
Well, it isn't a priority, and it isn't even on the radar. You know, it just is not. And the only time that there was really money spent on green jobs was during the economic recovery period, when governments did put money into it. And Canada was one of the worst. About a very small percentage of the total amount, about 8%, went toward green jobs. And you're right; they included as green jobs something not very useful at all. We had no program to integrate women into any of those jobs. The United States did have one. They had a decent program. It was limited. It was short term, but there was a recognition that something should be done. So there's a difference there in at least seeing a problem and seeing what could be done with public money.
You know, also when we think about our focus, you know, what we call our focus towards a green economy. It just seems there seems to be this concentration in, you know, sort of the weatherized industry, you know, around construction. You know, and some might say, yes, there's no doubt that, you know, there's a lot of women who can, you know, work in the construction industry, but are we being creative enough?
Well, there are things you can do. And actually, here in BC, we had one program once that was fabulous, and that was building the Vancouver Island Highway. Oh, wow. That was absolutely terrific. This was in the 90s, in the late 90s. And there was an actual, what happened is that the highway was going through First Nations land, so they had to have something to include First Nations in it. So they had a training program, and then there were a lot of women in government and people who were supportive of gendered initiatives in the government at that time who said, okay, we're going to have a training program for women and First Nations. And that actually happened, and it was totally terrific. They built 5 miles of the Vancouver Island Highway, women and men, and it was all the different trades. So there was good training there where it was more than simply waving flags and doing weatherization. Now what's happened mostly, and that's what happened in the United States, is that the training is for very simple, easy entry jobs. And so, of course, this doesn't lead to anything once that
long-term employment,
once that program is over, then people can't get a job. And it's very dependent on having those kinds of programs for households as well that encourage, through monetary rewards, encourage households to upgrade their windows or doors or various things like that. So it's not a genuine training program, unfortunately.
You know, there also seems to be this, you know, notion that a lot of some of these programs that were there, they also tended to target certain groups, women who, let's say, were on welfare, or women who, were experiencing chronic, unemployment, to the exclusion of all other women. And we know that, situations and life situations change at the drop of a hat. Should we not be even opening up to, all types of women, to ensure that we are actually equipping people with skills, so that at the moment that they decide that they want to jump into something else, that they have those skills and they can go out there and do the jobs, whatever they choose to do?
Unfortunately, what happens with many of these programs is that there are limited resources for them. And then the people in charge want to show very dramatic results. So often they will take people, and we also know that any kind of training programs that are intended to get people who are disadvantaged into the workforce are very slim. We don't have very many of them. They're not good enough. They're not long enough. They're not well enough resourced.
Yes.
And so whenever there is any money, then there's this attempt to try to do everything with a tiny bit of money. And of course, it doesn't do anything well, and it doesn't work for any of the population. So there has to be really serious kind of attention and serious resources given to this.
And we've also looked at some research that actually necessitates, with some of these programs, that go to necessitate that women pay for some of these programs, to attend programs.
Yes.
And these are some of the same programs that we know are free to men to attend. So, one would think that women who are already the most marginalized sectors in our communities and societies, who most of whom are paid far less than their male counterparts, it just seems like more slap in the face, more barriers and limitations.
When we had a very robust national feminist movement, there was a lot more attention paid to these kinds of training programs that were really very good. There was something called LEAP that was a terrific program which took women who were on social assistance or who were on unemployment insurance and trained them for a significant amount of time. Some of these programs are going on now, except that rather than giving women money to live on while they go through training, women now have to pay for it. So it services a different group of people. So the people who often need training and really a lot of attention and a lot of resources are simply not getting it.
No. Some of the assumptions out there to look at this issue is that existing gender inequalities, still continue to impede women's, goals for human development. What can we do about this?
Well, I do think, truly, that the crisis around the climate change and also the crisis in our economy, particularly around oil, I think that does give us opportunity to say, what direction should our economy go in? Yeah. And this is where, if we think about it, there are some kinds of jobs that are much more benign on this society that we do not have sufficient resources for. So, for example, we know there are really, really serious needs with regard to senior care. Yes. We know there's serious needs with regard to daycare. These are industries. These are industries that drive the economy. In fact, 2/3 of our economy is driven by service sector employment. And if these were the kinds of things we looked at, but unfortunately what happens is we have a mentality around what constitutes economic growth and development that is very much mired in the idea that it's only resource development or manufacturing. But there are other kinds of industries that propel growth and are good for people rather than the things that are very bad for people. We have to be a little bit more imaginative around how our economy can actually meet what people need now. Do we need more free trade agreements in which we're just going to have more and more things that none of us need circulating around the world?
Very much so.
Or are we going to focus on an economy that actually meets real needs that people have? And we have real needs that are not being met. We heard this, and we heard about autistic children. This is not being met. This is a kind of resource that could be seen as part of that's very green, and it does not harm the atmosphere, and it could be good for the economy.
We're going to take a quick short break, and we'll be right back.
Today's generation of young people spend the least amount of time outside of any generation in human history. We need to have children out. We need to have people out. in order to see the world around that allows us to live. I think something like the Sea to Sky Trail is the epitome of what we need to get people back out into the real world, to see nature as it can be, and something that we are a part of and that we must fight to protect.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're watching The Ledge, and today we're taking a look at women's work in a climate-changing world. And with me in the studio is Professor Marjorie Cohen of Simon Fraser University. You know, so as we talked about earlier in the first half of the show, there are other issues around this subject. What are some of those other issues and limitations that you see in your research?
Well, what I think is very important is that women aren't all the same.
Indeed.
And it makes a difference whether you live in rural areas, whether you live in the far north,
Yes.
whether you live in cities. And particularly when we think of Canada, which has, you know, such a diverse population and geography. So, for example, one of the papers at this conference was on what the gendered significance was of climate change in the Arctic for Inuit.
Very
And
much
of course,
so.
they are very, when I talk about gender, it also has implications for males that are distinct from females in a more traditional society like that. We have a big issue in resource development communities as well. There are big gendered issues here that you have to look at, and as we do deal with changes in the climate, how is this going to be affected, and how will families be affected? So that's one important issue. But I think the major one we have to look at, I mean, they're not that isn't major, but they are.
Yeah, they all
but
are,
the
yeah.
other major issue is to look at public policy and to see what we're doing and how that affects males and females differently. And if it does, what can we do to rectify that? So if we're putting in a carbon tax, for example, what does this mean for women? There is some research which indicates that it might be harder on women because women have lower incomes and therefore pay a larger proportion.
Yes.
On the other hand, men tend to drive more. So we have to look at these and say what is really. There has to be some consciousness of what the effect can be, whatever we are going to do.
So how do we go about enhancing public policy in a way that stimulates, you know, the supply of adequate green job programs? Because it seems that we're not doing enough in the way that we're focusing on our green economy.
Well, we have a very unambitious program in Canada. We're saying we're going to be off fossil fuels by the end of this century,
so.
which is not a particularly aggressive attack on this. So the first, what is most important is to have a real recognition that there is a serious problem, and we have to look at all of the kinds of tools that are available, including regulation, rethinking of the economic directions of the economy, in addition to the more market-oriented tools, which I find less effective, actually, than some of the other ways of thinking about how we might truly shift to a green economy. And that's where I think thinking about gender can help us with our imagination there. If we think about the kinds of work that are that is more benign, it's very much the kind of work that people in the services sector do. And if we think of how families and how people live and what they need to live,
their needs are,
and design our economy to meet those needs, then we could have a, the future could be brighter.
Could be brighter. So is there a way that, you know, we can ensure that women are not just, you know, an afterthought in Canada's, you know, climate action plan? How can we ensure that, you know, we're advancing equality in a way that, you know, makes that progress?
This is incredibly difficult because women have been after these things for a long time, and in the current election there isn't even a debate on women's issues, and by that I don't mean just talking about things that are traditionally women's issues, daycare and taking care of children and those sorts of things, although they are extremely important. But what is a feminist perspective on our society, and how does that influence? And this is something where where I think all the political parties need to put a lot more focus
into. Yes. And what role do you think also does the private sector play in this?
Well, the private sector is a very large proportion of our economy, so that is enormous. But what I find is that when the government shows a particular direction, the private sector tends to come along. And this was what happened when the feminist movement was strong in Canada. You did see not only the public sector responding and good programs happening and changes occurring, legislative changes occurring, but you also see the private sector wanting to show that they are doing this. And some of it's compulsion. Some of it's compulsion because in order to get government contracts, they have to do some of this stuff. And that's a very good way to do it. But what they discovered was that it didn't cost them, it didn't undermine their bottom line ultimately. It cost money, but it made things better for them often. So, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this, but nevertheless, it does seem that when government has a will for equity to happen, and when they have a will to reduce climate change, then things can change.
Everyone else follows suit.
They will follow suit.
Indeed, I couldn't agree with you more. So, in terms of the way that we look at this problem, because we all know that Canada, we are supposed to be leaders and pioneers, and as an advanced country, we should be able to really start identifying those very necessary clean energy that we know is going to be sustainable. As you said, have this crazy focus around fossil fuel, and we know that this is energy that it's not going to be sustainable forever. Yet we still seem to be taking the back seat, and it seems like there's no urgency.
There was a man from Sweden at my conference, and he was very interesting because he talked about the masculinities of climate change movement. And what he talked about was the masculinity that really focuses on technology as a solution.
Yes.
And when in fact, while this is part of the answer, this cannot be the entire
masculine way of thinking.
This will not be the entire solution. And what becomes very clear to me is that we can't just continue our vast consumption the way we do in rich countries. We do have to limit our consumption, and we can't do that and just say, oh, well, we can do that. All we have to do is to switch to another kind of cleaner energy, and that can still continue as it is. We have to really rethink our priorities, and we have to rethink our societies.
Okay. So I think it's the idea that if we have such, unsuccessful, integration of women into these, do we need to have, it has to do with policy. Obviously, we know it has everything to do with policy making, but as we know, if we don't have enough women at the table of policy making, we know if there's no representation, we know that, this is how these things happen. Women will continue to fall through the cracks. So is it about ensuring that there are enough women at the policy tables making the same, decisions that need to empower women into these positions?
That is a very important part of it all, but also important is to have enough information about how looking at gender can make a difference, because often women can be there but not necessarily have that gender consciousness around what it would mean around climate change policy. So that's where research comes together, where political action on the part of feminists comes.
About being educated on the
men
subject.
who also understand that that continuing this kind of massive consumption of things we don't really need in order to have a good life, that this is very, very harmful for the earth and for people.
Indeed. Well, what are your biggest recommendations and your solutions to ensuring that we come to a place where this is not an issue, say, in the next decade or so?
Oh my goodness, that's an enormous question.
Indeed.
I think the first thing we need to do is to have a genuine climate change policy with real compulsion around targets. I think we are going to have a serious rethink of what the economic objectives are. As long as our objective is to rip resources out of the ground and ship them off to other countries, then we will not have any kind of rational economy. I think we also have to be sure that we are inclusive in this, so that what we're doing when we're we're talking about economic policy and climate change policy is to say, how does this impact people on the ground? And what can we do around regulation in addition to market? We're only talking about market design solutions now, but we also have to think about regulation. And I think ultimately, nobody wants to talk about this, but ultimately, we are going to have to think about rationing resources in some way, because the way we use our material resources in this world is about as wasteful as could possibly be.
So it's probably going to take, a fundamental shift in the paradigm in the way that government develops, policies and green job programs.
Yes.
Indeed. Professor Marjorie Cohen, it's been such a wonderful pleasure. Thank you so much for being here.
The pleasure's mine.
We'll be right back.
We are kids.
Wish kids.
10,000 kids.
We are brave.
We are strong.
We are fighters.
Some days are good, some days are bad.
Some of us make it.
Some of us don't.
My wish will make me strong.
The Children's Wish Foundation of Canada.
Does a wish make a difference?
You bet.
You bet.
Imagine the difference a wish can make.
Only 2 more needles till my wish.
Please give today.
Welcome back, and we're just wrapping things up here on our look at women's work in a climate-changing world. Today's topic really needed to be highlighted in terms of looking at how far we've come in our commitment to give women a fair shake in society by making policies that see that all women benefit equally in green job policy initiatives and in all job policy initiatives in general. The truth is that some women's positions have changed for the better, but the truth of the matter is that that progress doesn't always reach further enough to all women, because we still have a lot of race, gender, and class bias still going on in society, and we have a lot of work to do in that area yet. And as with some of these issues, it is important that our governments take the lead in supporting the rise of all women into green job policy initiatives, so that not only will they be able to support themselves and their families, and in turn encourage future generations of girls about how vital their contributions are to our economy, but most importantly too, that they'll ultimately be able in the end to live up to their God-given potentials, as every person on earth deserves to do. And not just in the public sector. The private sector, too, has a responsibility to take the lead as well in these issues and make the right decisions concerning the hiring of all types of women, because in the end, you too have to decide whether you are part of a greater solution in our world or part of a continued growing problem in society. But we will all be hopeful and watch the direction of policies and the progress that's being made both in the public and the private sector. And that's our show. I'd like to thank my guest, Professor Marjorie Cohen of Simon Fraser University. Thank you so much. And you at home, thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, or if you love the work that we're doing, please go to our website, www.theledgetvshow.com, or you can also send your comments to our Facebook page, or you can tweet me at Lola Acala. And remember, guys, it is so much better to spread love than hate, because love is so much more powerful and beautiful. Until next time, take care of one another, and we'll see you soon.
Wants to be, it all becomes unclear. And before you know it, it's only a matter of time. And it's right before you. So don't give up. No. Truly know that God has said who you are. It all becomes so clear.